So the project is, of course, an attempt to naturalize phenomenology, and the whole collection is different prospects and projects of different attempts to naturalize phenomenology and find different formal paradigms for its formalization. So what does phenomenology do in this quote unquote transcendentalist naturalized extension of its regular enterprise? Well, it provides constraints on naturalistic explanation, and it provides constraints by pursuing or offering mathematical models and computer simulations that basically tell you what are invariant constraints that regulate the production of any quote unquote empirical objective naturalist explanation. So in this regard, it is very neo-Kantian in approach, right? What philosophy does is it produces a series of a priori's, as it were, which regulate the different branches or data of the different sciences, empirical sciences. And the actual characterization that Petitot gives us is that it pursues a quote, mathematical schematization of phenomenological descriptive eidetics. What does this mean? Phenomenological descriptive eidetics is phenomenological descriptive reports of experience given in natural language. So I describe how it is that I perceive a tree as being green, extended, as being, weighty, heavy, oppressing, whatever you want. That's a natural linguistic characterization, which is how it is that phenomenology has been carried out traditionally during most of its life, right? And the idea is that you can produce a mathematical schematization of this descriptive eidetics, which is to say something that Husserl thought could not be done. Now we're going to see exactly what Husserl thought could not be done, right? But there's two slogans that summarize this entire project, and this is the ones at the bottom, and they're summarized in two quotes. Every description is the name of a problem, and two, every concept is the name of an unknown algorithm. Algorithm, therefore, corresponds to a schematization, which already tells you something. This is being used, this idea of a mathematical schematization is being used in the Kantian sense. And if you remember, one of the things that we saw already in the first week was that when Kant speaks of the transcendental imagination as this quote unquote algorithmically structured way in which the mind, the subject, synthesizes intuitions in accordance with the categories, he speaks of a secret art of the soul, encrypted art of the soul. And much of what is going on in this project is an attempt to decrypt the art of the soul, to make explicit the mathematical algorithmic rules through which the field of experience can not only be described in accordance with a categorical framework, but what is the formal framework that formalizes all phenomenological eidetic descriptions. In other words, rather than having science on the one hand and a categorical framework on the other, and then trying to establish the conditions of transit, what Petitot is trying to do is beginning with the descriptive eidetics of phenomenology, of perceptual phenomenology, to derive a mathematical schematization that describes the formal structure of the perceptual world, of perceptual experience. A particular, well, with Laurel and Petitot, you get two versions of this, how the movement towards abstraction operates in Paranoia as well. In the case of Laurel, you have this like suspicion, which we have seen is already incubated with Kant, which is that we have this successive sort of attempt to purify what has been unstated contaminations by the empirical. So philosophy is nothing but an attempt to interrogate the conditions for the conditions for the conditions for the conditions. And this bottoms out or reaches an extreme point where Laurel tells us that in fact philosophy is nothing but, contamination, that it is nothing but this admixture of transcendence and immanence, and that therefore, in order to purify the transcendental from this contamination, it has to abstract itself from the framework of transcendence and from philosophy altogether, to step outside of itself and to try to draw the invariant structures of philosophy. It's not that philosophy needs to abstract the invariant structures of experience or the world or whatever, is that non-philosophy, a transcendental science, must understand the separation of transcendence from immanence and the way in which philosophy, as a discourse, always produces a mixture and a contamination. So this perpetual suspicion, this paranoid suspicion that philosophy has not cleansed itself sufficiently, that it harbors these metaphysical assumptions or empirical assumptions underneath its pretensions to ground or to unground the empirical or metaphysics, right? Reaches an extreme point when it is said to us that you have to have a transcendental science that for philosophy as such. In other words, that philosophy has to be taking as a material, as an empirical support, its terms and its concepts for a transcendental science. I mean, this is as meta as you can possibly hope for, right? The other sense of abstraction, of course, is trying to achieve a rigorous formalization of the original transcendental project, which, as we have seen, has been contaminated since its origins, not only by an scholastic ontological framework of, an ontology borrowed from the scholastics and the neo-Aristotelian framework of the categories and the account of the understanding in Kant, but also with a theological impetus within itself, right? A theological impetus that leads you, precisely in the case of Laurel, for example, to rehearse this quote-unquote negative theological tropes that always position the real, the one, as a kind of polar opposite in relationship to knowledge. And this is what Catherine and positive constructive phenomenology today tries to do against this vector of exceeding abstraction or exceeding, sort of like withdrawing from the conditions into a kind of like higher plane of purity. It tries to directly assume the task of a science by modeling the old project of a science of experience, right? Let's take perceptual experience and let's do a rigorous phenomenology that takes its cue from differential topology or something like that. And on the basis of that, you have all these like research programs that diversify transcendental science into, quote unquote, a series of formal paradigms and research paradigms and so on. So there's two ways out of this. A constructivist scientific orientation, which corresponds to the original impetus of the Kantian scientific side, reconciling philosophy with, quote unquote, the new science. But then there is another vector, which is on the side of Kant's theological side, which is to try to decant the purity of being or the real from the conditions of individuation or transcendence, right? To get an ever more purified account of the transcendental. And that's what's represented in this trajectory that goes from Heidegger to Laurel, right? At the end of the tunnel.